surface level information. So the entire, our orientation will have to be then, addressing towards that. For instance, I'll give you an example. History. History is often considered to be a bundle of information, whereas historians are the way in which history is being developed as a discipline is through fundamentally the process of analysis, looking at evidences, sifting through evidences, eliminating contradictions, um, building on things which seem to be contributing to a certain hypothesis, testing those hypotheses. Those are the kinds of abilities which are involved in history, not just information. Information can be gathered by anybody. You don't need to be a historian for that. So just to teach information, you don't need to really teach history. History is not just the information, it is actually the underlying intellectual processes, which are basically analysis. A lot of why we emphasize on this information as opposed to things which are going to be part of the residual learning is because the way our assessment is based, our examinations. One of the things which we have to change if we have to ever dream of modernizing our curriculum is exams. Exams, as we find today, are the real impediment to any kind of change. First of all, we have to abolish that office called the Controller of Examinations. That is something which we must abolish. All progressive universities have done it. I think it's about time for us to do that also. This whole business of secrecy and confidentiality and centralized question papers and everything is out of date. No university, no good university anywhere in the world follows it. We are still holding on to some of these archaic practices. What happens in exams is we are reducing everything to what may be called paper pencil abilities. Things which can be written in 3 hours. You compress everything, whatever you have studied, into things which you can write in 3 hours. It becomes more like a testing of speed. How much are you able to write in 3 hours? That really matters. This is especially true with some of the so-called scientifically developed entrance examination, like IIT entrance examination, for instance. It's a speed test more than the power test. It evaluates people's speed. Out of 300 items which have been given in 180 minutes or whatever, you are supposed to do as many as you can, and there are negative marking, and then the speed is what really matters. And how the speed is accomplished? By doing away with thinking. Coaching centers for IITs actually tell the students who are being coached, saying that don't waste your time thinking. You use algorithms which already you have developed and use only those items which you're familiar with, and find out from the multiple choice, you find out through estimation what might be the correct answer, and write that only if you're sure. If you're not sure, leave it, because there is negative marking. So a test which is supposed to encourage problem solving and thinking, the way to crack the exam is actually not to do any thinking, just practicing, drill. That is the only way the people are actually training themselves to pass these so-called scientifically constructed exams. And I'm not exaggerating. I think there have been ethnographic studies on Kota, the city of Kota, where these students are being coached for this purpose. There's a very interesting documentary which was made there. It's called The Engineered Dreams. And this was all about the entrance examinations for IIT and in this town called Kota in Rajasthan, and how the entire enterprise works, this entire industry works. So this entire industry is sustained on the fact that exams are a certain kind, which actually emphasizes a certain kind of abilities. Learning is like, if I may use a metaphor from spectrography. It's a learning is actually a broad spectrum enterprise, whereas what is assessed is only a small, narrow band in that. So since emphasis is on what is assessed, instead of assessing what is learned, we are landing up with learning what is assessed. You understand what I mean? It is actually putting the entire enterprise on its head. You have to, your exam is supposed to test what the students have learned. And instead, we land up teaching and the students land up learning what is examined. So examination in a way determines what is taught. This is something which you need to really look at very seriously, because I really feel that the crux of the problem in curriculum and curriculum reform is the impediment that the examination system causes. Something for you to really um, look at. Now, another thing which I think I'm now moving to learning. See, the central enterprise of your entire exercise is not teaching. It's learning. The protagonist of this drama is the learner. The teacher is not the protagonist. The teacher is only a support role. The teacher is a support actor, but the learner is the hero. Learning is the central element of what the entire thing is all about. Teaching is a facilitative process. Teaching is a second order activity. In other words, teaching is not a performance. It's not about our going and performing something. And then once we have performed very well, we feel happy that, oh, we have performed well. It doesn't matter at all how we perform. What is important is that what is the process through which the learner has actually gone through. I started my career about 40 years ago. I was a young teacher, quite almost just out of teenage, and taught a hell lot of myself. And then my first class I taught was a class of 200 students, 150 students. And that was a gallery, and it's a very, very ego boosting experience of addressing a gallery of eager looking students, and some of them were not much younger than me. They were almost my age. So I the first week went off very well. I prepared very well, and I spoke very well, and I was very happy, and then I was upbeat and everything. And students used to, these wide-eyed people used to be sitting in the front bench and looking at me like that. It's such a ego boosting exercise, and the experience, you can't tell me. you know that you have all experienced it. The whole thing, I had a reality check. After about 2 weeks, a few students marched into my cabin. They came and said, in Gujarati, I was teaching in a university in Gujarat, and they came to me and said in Gujarati, which I could barely understand, but I could make out what they were saying. They said, "You teach so well, sir. You teach so well that we don't understand even a word of what you're saying." So that actually, grounded me. That was an experience which actually brought me down to Mother Earth with a thud, and I have never quite recovered from that experience even today. So all this great eloquence that we have about how we are able to express and how well we are, how articulate we are, etc., is of no use whatsoever if we are not able to create a little ripple, a little perturbance in the mental space of the students out there. And what makes it more complicated is the fact that you have these all-knowing, eager beavers sitting in the front bench with a wide eye, almost giving you a feedback from second to second saying that you are doing very well. Whereas there are many others. It's a heterogeneous group. Heterogeneity is something which we need to take for granted. So I really, from then on, I actually try to look at always the backbenchers. I would call it, and I have been telling this to my colleagues in the university where I used to work, Maushpi and I used to work earlier. And I used to tell this to colleagues that, you focus on the oil line. And what is this oil line? Oil line is when the backbenchers in a bored manner, they recline, their hair, oily hair, touches the wall behind. And that creates an oil line. The thicker the oil line, the more bored they are. And if you focus all your attention on the oil line, I can assure you that you may be a more effective teacher. It doesn't matter whether these wide-eyed front benchers are giving you positive vibes. That's not what we are here for. Heterogeneity is a reality in Indian higher education class, particularly in public universities. So that is something which I think we need to live with. And it's important for us to really ensure that we cater to the people who are real fragile and real marginal, and who otherwise our teaching is of no good. Another thing is actually, I'm again skipping to another point. Another point is actually the eagerness, and this is particularly true when you develop your own curriculum, and the eagerness with which you stuff things into your teaching. So you feel you want to teach that, and you want to teach this, and you have to teach the other, and everything within a limited curricular time frame. It's a bit like, and you're all rice eaters in a home, and you will know this, that you in a small vessel, if you stuff too much rice and try to cook, it doesn't cook. There is an optimum amount of rice you can cook in a vessel of a certain kind. It's true with curriculum as well. You try to over teach stuff, it doesn't work. Nothing is learned, nothing is digested. So there is an optimum which you can teach. There has to be time for people to breathe, time for people to reflect, time for people to chew the cud, so to say, of what you teach. And then that is a very important aspect of curriculum. So the stuffing too many things, 146 credits in a 3-year course, etc. I'm not very enthusiastic about this, adding too many credits. That doesn't add value to the program, because you are basically creating, overstuffing your students, and they're not assimilating even optimally. Their assimilation comes down in a suboptimal level. I'll talk about one more point and I'll stop. I know that I've already reached 45 minutes. And then whatever little time we have, we'll do for interaction. And that is this, that another point which national education policy wants you to address is the whole idea of multidisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity. I think there's that phrase is peppered all over the national education policy. You will find it everywhere, and you will even wonder what is it all about. But the entire enterprise of interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity stems out of the fact that particularly in postgraduate teaching, and this is all the most so in postgraduate teaching, that you are basically preparing them to get into the frontier of knowledge. And the frontier of knowledge is not in terms of single disciplines anymore. The new knowledge that is created is not within the core of disciplines. The new knowledge that is created is always in the cusp between disciplines, in the cusp areas between disciplines. That's where new perspectives are being made, whether it be in pure sciences or in applied sciences or in social sciences, any which area you take, you will find that much of the new knowledge that is being generated are in the cusp areas between disciplines. So you need to really have a fresh look at the discipline-oriented teaching that you are doing all this while, because that has a historicity. You must remember, many of the disciplines which we teach today as though they were God-given, they don't have a long history. Much of the social sciences we teach today are less than 100 years old. Just 150 years ago, physics, or 200 years ago, physics was never even called physics. It was part of what is known as a natural philosophy. During Isaac Newton's time, Isaac Newton didn't call himself a physicist. We call him physicist, whereas he called himself a natural philosopher. Karl Marx didn't call himself a economist. The whole christening of some of these terms like sociology, economics, all these are 20th century enterprises. Definitely they're after the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was the time when actually division of labor was more or less became pronounced. And it's important for people to get into the enterprise of generating knowledge within these frontiers, within these contours of that discipline. So it became like an industrial activity. Whereas it has now reached a stage of saturation. In institutions of tomorrow, you will find that in departments, this ossified silos that we create called departments have no relevance. What is more important is the intercommunality between departments. People who are stuck in specific silos and will only talk to those people within the silo are not going to be very productive. The ones who are going to be most productive are the one productive, not in terms of just generating more and more of the same, but in terms of generating new perspectives, are the ones who are going to interact with other disciplines. So historians will have to talk to sociologists, sociologists will have to talk to anthropologists, anthropologists and historians both will have to talk to people from literary theory, cultural theories or literary theories, or similarly in sciences. Much of the work that is happening in life sciences today are done by physicists. The whole idea that we have a very archaic way of looking at basic sciences. Life sciences students seldom get a training in mathematics, whereas much of what is happening in life sciences in the frontiers use mathematics in a big way, modeling and stuff like that. So I think it's important for us to have a relook at the entire configuration of disciplines and the manner in which it constitutes the knowledge generation process. So this is an opportunity for you, particularly with autonomy coming to individual colleges and institutions. This will enable you to do a new kind of thinking, new way of responding to the situation. You don't really need to passively follow what has been dictated to you anymore. I think it's a very enabling, that way NEP 2020 has been a very enabling document for those practitioners of higher education who really want to make the best of it. I'll stop here, and I'll be, Iqbal, if you don't mind, if you think that there are questions which need to be addressed. Not that I can again say that as a caveat that I may not be able to answer all the questions. I have some thoughts. I've shared that with you. If you have some thoughts, you can probably also share. Some of them may elicit a response from you. Some of them may not. I may not be competent enough to respond. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. That was very enriching and I think thought-provoking. In the chat box, there is no question. Okay, so there is one question now. This is from Haripriya Datta. What? So this is not a question. Okay, I'm still waiting for questions.
Observations. Yeah.
Compliments.
Thank you.
So I would like to have at least some questions.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
This is Kakuli Day, and many of the times I happen to hear you, and every time I hear you, it's so inspiring. I met you personally also in Jesus and Mary College in Delhi.
Okay.
And what you have said just a couple of minutes back, like, having a multilinguistic, a multidisciplinary approach is very important. But here I'd like to tell you that I'm in linguistics for the last 25 years. And every time I meet even educated people, they ask me, which language do you know? Or which language do you work on? So this is one of a very, embarrassing situation if I have to explain them that what is linguistics all about. And literally speaking, in India, linguistics is done in a very one-way traffic. Like, they go and collect data, or they generate data and they sit down for analysis. But I trained on the social linguistic aspect. I've seen that you have to start from the history, know its background, then go to anthropology, sociology, every aspect of a community. Only then you can understand the language. So I'm very glad that you have brought this thing, and I'm very, very happy that at least someone is there who can think on this line. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. It's Dibakar Mount, and actually, I want to thank you for your mesmerizing session. It is very wonderful, and I think I'm from English background, so I will just appreciate you that it is a kind of dramatic impact that you have created upon us. So my little question is, so the traditional way that we are having now the curriculum, so is it the kind of machinery, the impact of the capitalism or maybe the globalization, that we are just creating some machinery parts which will fit the bigger machinery, and if it is not fit totally, it will just out. So is it that kind of thing is happening in the present day situation, sir? Thank you, sir.
Hmm. Well, Dipakar, if I may call you Dipakar,
Okay, so Dibakar, sir.
um, see, the critical theorists, there is a whole uh, area of knowledge called in critical theory, particularly related to critical sociology in educators. You must have heard of people like Paulo Freire and all these people. They really thought about this idea quite deeply. Um, there is a there is a there is a strong how do I put it, a reason to believe that I think in the post-colonial kind of setup, I think all of us are in some sense subsumed for the development of the under the project of development of the global capital, and therefore I think we our objects of our specific higher education enterprises are essentially feeding into that. So that of course is true, but be that as it may, there is also possibility of, once we are aware of it, we should actually also think in terms of subverting it.
Yes.
So that's where I think, I think the creativity comes. We
Yes.
have been given a script, and that script has to be enacted. But we don't need to do that completely. We try to sort of transcend the script and use our own creativity to come out of what is historically ordained to us. That is the challenge of critical education,
Yes.
whether it
Yes.
is school level or the higher education level. So we need to really look at, we need to understand. I completely agree with you that we need to understand the whole purpose of this enterprise, what ostensibly looks like the purpose of this enterprise, and we need to really work towards transcending that, subverting that. So that is the challenge that we have in it. So if globalization or the globalized world, or even at the moment, I think we seem to be in a reverse kind of a trend with Mr. Trump and the tendencies of that kind. But all the same, I think you're right in the sense that we seem to be looking at the marketability of Indian talents in the
Yes,
global.
sir. Yes, sir.
We seem to be always working towards that. Our criteria of excellence and our criteria of international acceptability, our criteria of what is considered global universities, and so on, are essentially predicated by our understanding of what as the market in the international world.
Yes.
So that doesn't need to be the way in which we should act. For instance, I personally believe that every global, every university or institution that is aspiring to get a global recognition has to be, first of all, relevant locally. This global and local, they are not like Lego toys, which are planted here, or it can be planted there, or it can be planted somewhere else. I mean, every institution has its roots. So if Tejpur University should primarily look at not just the what is globally accepted as excellence, but also what is locally relevant to the ecosystem in which the Tejpur University is actually placed. So
Yes.
both things are not contradictory, but it's important to bring that complementarity very clearly. That in a way makes us transcend the kind of specific role that the global capital is actually imposing on us. That's my sense. I
Yes, sir.
would like to be an optimist in this. Otherwise, we'll think that nothing can be done. It's a lost case. But
Okay.
I don't think that's a very productive way of looking at stuff.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Sir, there are two questions in the chat box, which is
Okay.
I think similar. One is by Handhani Datta and another is Devojit Bora. So it's about if we have to get away from the traditional examination system. So what will be our your suggestion towards an alternative model?
See, it's not that something new need to be done. We have already institutions have been following certain kinds of approaches. For instance, there are universities in India where the teachers themselves create their assessment tools and implement those assessment tools. There are no standard stipulations for that. For instance, I mean, at least the university where Maushami and I had taught, there we had defined that every course can have as many assessment situations as needed. Only thing is that there was a minimum. The minimum is 3. There has to be 3 assessment situations at least. And not in each of those assessment situations cannot be more than 40% of the total weightage. That means even the final exam cannot have more than 40% of the total weightage. And you don't need to have a final exam. You can have 10% each. There are 10 assessment episodes can be there, each one having 10%. That's also possible. No one assessment episode can have more than 40%. So that itself took away the weight from the final exam oriented anxiety, and where it has to be centrally administered and so on. So in most of the courses that is transacted in that university, the exams are conducted centrally. And so exams are conducted by the teachers themselves. So first of all, you need to have a trust in the teachers. Otherwise, it will not work. The whole system works on the basis of trust. And of course, the trust does not mean it's unlimited autonomy. The teachers can do anything, or I decide to teach only the first 2 units and only ask questions from the first 2 units. That will not work, because there is also an accountability to the peer group. There is a larger program team to which I think you have to make a monthly progress thing, or twice a semester or something like that. So there is a way of ensuring that the stipulated curriculum is actually followed, and the curricula themselves is created by the teacher in consultation with the peers. So it is not as though something has been imposed from above. So, and there are many other universities of the same kind. It's not that as though these are all new ideas. There are several. So I think it's important for at least at the institutional level, when institutions acquire autonomy, I think some of these things need to be tried out. We can't really have, if a college becomes autonomous tomorrow, it doesn't have to replicate all the structures that a large university, affiliating university should have. I can understand the predicaments of large affiliating universities, but this 2020 national education policy is aiming to do away with affiliation as a model, which is very interesting, in my opinion. It's full of possibilities.
Sir, I think we can take another question.
Yeah, I don't mind.
So there is one from Haripriya Datta. So she mentioned that I see some of the institution segregate the students into groups to reduce the heterogeneity, as you mentioned. So what is your view on this?
I really don't know what Dr. Datta is hinting at. segregating students into groups to reduce the heterogeneity, as you mentioned. See, there is a heterogeneity in the Indian higher education, public higher education. I'm not talking about private universities because that's a different ball game altogether. So in the public universities, at least there is a certain heterogeneities because these are, only 26% of the 70 to 23 age group students are having any access to higher education. School education has become universal more or less. So there is a whole generation of people who are now aspiring to get into some kind of higher education. So all those people are coming into public higher education institutions demanding admission there. So in that, therefore, naturally, there is a greater amount of heterogeneity. Uh, uh, so in that, I really don't know what Dr. Datta means by saying that some institutions are segregating students into groups. My general feeling is that some of the students who are in the margins need to be attended to specifically, and that is, for instance, language is a major issue in the graduation particularly, and if English is the language of instruction, there is a reason why English is pursued, because that's what is marketable and that's what everybody considers as value. And there is every reason why the poorest of poor among the Indians would aspire their children to acquire a higher education in English, which is what is accepted in the market. So everybody has an aspiration to get into the core of the economy. So English becomes a very important barrier. So it is important for us to focus on the students in the margins and help them tide over this barrier. And that's not going to be very easy. It cannot be just done through remedial English classes or something like that alone. In universities, some large universities which are fully residential, including Tezpur, the real induction happens of these students through peer group interactions in hostels. So that's where I think the real, getting the people who are not familiar with higher education are inducted into the modes and languages of higher education. So that's how I would say. I didn't quite understand what Dr. Datta is. Maybe she has a
Uh,
specific.
yeah, I think it's got clear anyway. Thank you, sir.